If you think people like me don't belong here, you're already looking in the wrong direction. The words didn't come from the stage, but they echoed through the marble hall of the Manhattan Gala like a crack in glass no one had expected to hear. Crystal chandeliers burned overhead, scattering light across polished floors where billionaires, investors, and media elites stood frozen mid-conversation. Richard Callahan, the billionaire CEO whose name carried weight in every corner of Wall Street, paused just long enough for the silence to notice him. He wasn't a man who hesitated. He rarely needed to. Tonight, everything about him was controlled, tailored, and sharp enough to cut through any room without effort. But across the ballroom, near the service corridor where the light dimmed and the air felt heavier, Alicia Bennett stood in a simple janitor's uniform, holding a cleaning cart that looked too small for the space she had been placed in. No one had introduced her. No one needed to. In rooms like this, people were labeled before they spoke. A few guests glanced at her and then looked away as if she were part of the furniture that simply belonged in the background. Richard's gaze found her anyway. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't recognition. It was something colder, something measured, like he was assessing a detail that didn't belong in his carefully constructed environment. "You missed a spot," he said flatly, his voice carrying just enough for nearby guests to hear. A few of them chuckled, small polite sounds that didn't quite hide their discomfort. Alicia didn't respond. She knelt slowly, pressing a cloth against a faint spill on the floor, her movements steady, deliberate, almost like she had learned how to exist inside moments like this without breaking. The music from the string quartet continued, but it felt distant now, like it belonged to another world entirely. Richard took a step closer, his presence pulling attention without him needing to ask for it. Cameras shifted subtly, phones angled without being raised. People always noticed when power changed direction, even slightly. "People like you are hired to clean, not to observe," he said, his tone calm enough to sound like a fact rather than an insult. The words settled into the air, and for a moment, the room seemed to wait for Alicia to collapse under them, to shrink, to disappear back into the background where everyone expected her to stay. But she didn't. She simply finished wiping the floor, folded the cloth neatly, and placed it back on her cart with care that felt almost intentional. When she finally stood, her eyes lifted, not in defiance, not in anger, but in a quiet stillness that made the surrounding noise feel uncertain. Richard held her gaze longer than he intended. Something about it didn't fit the story he had already written in his mind. Across the room, a server moved quickly through the crowd, carrying a tablet pressed close to his chest. He slowed for a fraction of a second when he passed Alicia, his expression shifting in a way that suggested recognition, then doubt, then silence. The moment passed too quickly for anyone else to notice, except Richard, who noticed everything whether he wanted to or not. And then, from the far end of the gala hall, near the grand staircase where guests were gathering for the next announcement, a small voice broke through the polished atmosphere. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady enough to stop movement without demanding it. "Mom." The word didn't belong in that room. Heads turned slowly, almost unwillingly, as a young boy stepped into view. He couldn't have been older than 6, dressed in a simple suit that looked slightly too big for his frame. His eyes scanned the room with a calm that didn't match his age. He wasn't lost. He wasn't afraid. He was looking for someone he already knew was there. And when his gaze landed on Alicia, everything in him shifted forward at once, as if the world had finally aligned itself into something familiar. The word stayed in the air longer than it should have, as if the entire room needed a moment to decide whether it had actually been spoken. "Mom." In a place where every name was filtered through titles, status, and reputation, it landed like something too human to belong inside marble walls and crystal light. Alicia Bennett did not move at first. Her hands remained near the handle of the cleaning cart, her posture steady, but something in her expression shifted almost imperceptibly, like a door inside her had opened just enough to let memory breathe. The little boy stepped forward slowly, his eyes locked on her face with the kind of certainty that only comes from recognition without doubt. Around them, the gala continued to exist in fragments. Glasses paused midair. Conversations thinned into silence. Even the string quartet seemed to hesitate between notes. Richard Callahan turned slightly, his attention now divided between the boy and the woman he had just dismissed with words he did not think would matter beyond the moment they were spoken. But something about the child unsettled that assumption. The boy stopped a few feet from Alicia, his small hands clenched at his sides for a second before relaxing. Then he said her name again, softer this time, as if confirming she was real. Alicia slowly stood straighter, her eyes never leaving him. There was no panic in her face, no rush to explain, only a quiet stillness that carried years of distance inside it. Richard's gaze sharpened. He looked at the boy again, this time not as a presence in the room, but as a pattern he was beginning to recognize without permission. The shape of the eyes, the line of the jaw, the stillness in the expression that felt too familiar to be coincidence. A guest nearby leaned slightly toward another, whispering something that never fully formed into words. The atmosphere shifted in subtle ways, like pressure changing before a storm. Alicia finally spoke, her voice calm but weighted. "You were not supposed to come here tonight." The boy lowered his eyes briefly, then looked back up with quiet determination. "I wanted to see him." The sentence landed differently than everything before it. Richard stepped forward without realizing he had moved. "See who?" he asked, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier certainty. The boy did not answer immediately. Instead, his gaze moved past Alicia, past the crowd, until it settled directly on Richard. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of recognition forming in real time. Alicia closed her eyes for a brief moment, then opened them again. When she spoke, her words were not loud, but they carried cleanly through the hall. "He already knows." A ripple moved through the guests, subtle but undeniable. Richard felt something tighten in his chest, not emotion exactly, but the collapse of distance between assumption and possibility. The boy took one more step forward, stopping just within reach of the light that surrounded Richard. He tilted his head slightly, studying him the way children study unfamiliar truths. "Are you him?" he asked simply, without accusation, without fear. Only curiosity shaped by certainty he did not yet understand. Richard did not answer immediately. For the first time in a very long time, he appeared to be searching for a response that could not be calculated. Alicia remained still beside the cleaning cart, but her eyes did not leave either of them. The Gala, once filled with controlled elegance, now felt like a room holding its breath. And in that silence, something long buried began to surface without permission. The silence in the ballroom was no longer accidental. It had become heavy, intentional, almost unbearable, as if every person present understood they were witnessing something that would not stay contained within these walls. Richard Callahan remained still, his eyes fixed on the child in front of him, but for the first time that evening, the confidence in his posture felt interrupted by something he could not immediately define. The boy stood only a few feet away now, close enough for every detail to be seen without effort. The shape of his face, the steady gaze, the quiet certainty in his expression, all of it pressed against Richard's memory like a key turning in a locked door he had never admitted existed. Alicia Bennett did not step forward. She did not retreat either. She simply remained beside the cleaning cart, her presence no longer invisible to anyone in the room. The staff who had once walked past her without notice now seemed unsure where to look. Some stared directly. Others pretended not to. But no one looked away completely. Richard finally spoke again, though his voice carried less authority than before. "Where did you bring him from?" he asked, the question shaped more by disbelief than accusation. Alicia did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice remained steady, almost calm in a way that contrasted the tension surrounding them. "He did not come from anywhere. He has always been here in this city. You just never looked." The words were not loud, but they moved through the crowd with clarity. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, as if realizing they had become part of something they were not prepared to interpret. The boy took another small step forward, now directly beneath the soft edge of the chandelier light. He looked up at Richard again, studying him with a focus that did not feel childish, but instead deeply observant. "I know who you are," the boy said quietly. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. "And how exactly would you know that?" he replied. The boy glanced back at Alicia for a brief moment, then returned his gaze to Richard. "Because she told me the truth," he said simply. The sentence hung in the air longer than anything else that night. Richard exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, as if trying to maintain control over a situation that was slipping outside the boundaries of his understanding. Around them, the gala felt suspended. Conversations had fully stopped now. Glasses were no longer lifted. Even movement seemed hesitant, as though the room itself feared interrupting what was unfolding. Alicia finally stepped forward, not aggressively, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that drew attention without demanding it. She stopped a few feet from Richard, close enough that their words would not need to be raised. "You did not notice us," she said. "Not then, and not now. That is the difference." Richard looked at her directly now, really looking, as if seeing her for the first time beyond the labels he had once assigned without thought. There was no anger in her expression. There was no need for it. The absence of it made the moment heavier. The boy remained between them, small but steady, as if he had been standing at the center of this distance his entire life without knowing it. Richard's gaze shifted again to him, and something subtle changed in his expression, not full realization, but the beginning of it, forming slowly like a truth that refuses to be ignored once seen. The air in the room felt thinner now, not because anything had been taken away, but because something undeniable had been added. And in that quiet, without announcement or permission, the balance of everything Richard Callahan believed he controlled began to shift. For several seconds after Alicia's words settled into the air, no one in the ballroom moved. It was not the kind of silence that comes from confusion, but the kind that comes from recognition forming too slowly to be denied. Richard Callahan stood at the center of it, his posture still upright, but something in his expression had begun to fracture in small, almost invisible ways. The certainty he had carried into the evening no longer fit the moment he was standing in. The boy remained in front of him, quiet, steady, waiting without urgency, as if time itself had already taught him patience. Richard's eyes lowered slightly, studying him again, not as a guest, not as a stranger, but as a pattern his mind could not fully reject. The resemblance was no longer something he could dismiss as coincidence. It was in the structure of the face, the quiet intensity in the gaze, the subtle stillness that felt too familiar to ignore. Alicia's voice broke the silence again, softer now, but even more precise. "I did not bring him here to surprise you," she said. "I brought him because he is old enough to understand what has been happening around him, even when you chose not to see it." Richard's hands remained at his sides, but the tension in them was noticeable now. Around them, guests began to shift their attention away from their conversations entirely. Some took small steps forward, as if drawn by a force they could not name. Others remained frozen, uncertain whether they were witnessing a private moment or a public collapse. The boy looked up at Richard again, and this time there was something different in his expression. Not doubt, not fear, but a quiet question that had been carried for a long time. "Why did you never come?" he asked. The question was simple, but it struck the room with unexpected weight. Richard did not answer immediately. For the first time in a long time, there was no prepared response available to him. He looked at Alicia, then back at the boy, as if trying to reconstruct a timeline that no longer aligned with his memory. "I did not know," he said finally, though the words sounded less like certainty and more like an attempt to stabilize something slipping beneath him. Alicia did not react to his answer. Instead, she took a small step closer, stopping just within a distance where her voice would not need to carry. "You did not know because you did not ask," she said. "And when you did not ask, you decided it did not matter." The words were not raised, yet they reached every corner of the room with clarity. Richard's gaze hardened slightly, not in anger, but in the instinctive resistance of someone encountering responsibility they had never prepared for. The boy shifted his weight slightly, still watching him, still waiting. Around them, the gala no longer felt like an event. It felt like a space that had been paused mid-breath, held together only by the presence of a truth that had finally entered it. Richard's voice lowered. "If what you are implying is true," he said carefully, "then why now?" Alicia met his gaze without hesitation. "Because he deserves to be seen in a room where you have always been seen," she replied. The sentence landed without escalation, without performance, but with a finality that made several guests instinctively look away. Richard remained silent after that, not because he had nothing to say, but because every possible response felt insufficient against what was now standing in front of him. The boy did not move closer or further away. He simply stood in the space between what was known and what was finally being acknowledged, while the room around them waited for something no longer able to be delayed. The atmosphere inside the gala had changed in ways no one could fully articulate. What had begun as a night of elegance and control now felt like a room suspended between certainty and collapse, where every breath seemed to wait for permission that no longer came. Richard Callahan stood motionless at the center of it, but the stillness around him no longer matched the stillness within him. Something had shifted, not outwardly in a dramatic way, but internally, in the quiet erosion of assumptions he had never questioned before. The boy remained in front of him, patient and unwavering, his small presence anchored in a truth that did not require validation from the room. Alicia Bennett stood a few steps behind, her expression calm, her posture steady, as if she had already carried this moment far longer than anyone else in the room understood. Richard finally spoke again, but his voice had lost its earlier precision. "You are saying this is not a misunderstanding," he said slowly, as if testing the structure of the sentence before allowing it to exist. Alicia did not hesitate. "I am saying you were never part of the uncertainty," she replied. The words were simple, but they carried weight that settled across the surrounding silence. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, realizing that what they were witnessing could no longer be categorized as spectacle or rumor. It had become something else entirely, something anchored in time rather than interpretation. Richard's eyes returned to the boy again. The resemblance was no longer something his mind could debate away. It had become something that pressed against his perception until denial felt less like logic and more like avoidance. The boy looked back at him without fear, only curiosity, as if studying a figure he had heard about long before ever seeing him in person. "Do you know who I am?" Richard asked quietly. The boy nodded once. "Yes," he said, "but I do not think you know me." The simplicity of the response unsettled the space between them more than any accusation could have. Alicia stepped forward again, closing the distance just enough for her voice to carry clearly to him without forcing attention from the entire room. "He knows your name," she said, "but he does not know your time. That is something different." Richard's jaw tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in the effort of processing something that did not fit into the framework he had built his life around. Around them, the gala guests no longer pretended to observe casually. Their attention had become complete, though silent, as if the entire room had collectively agreed that movement would interrupt something irreversible. The boy shifted slightly closer to Alicia, not hiding behind her, but aligning himself with her presence in a way that suggested familiarity rather than dependence. Richard noticed that too. The detail added another layer to what he was beginning to understand, though he did not yet have language for it. Alicia's voice softened slightly, but it did not lose clarity. "I did not come here to ask for recognition," she said. "I came because silence only protects the person who is never questioned." Richard looked at her for a long moment. For the first time, there was no immediate counterargument forming behind his expression. The control he had maintained through years of negotiation, command, and distance felt less reliable in a space where truth was not something he could restructure. The boy glanced up at him again. "Are you going to keep standing there?" he asked gently. "Or are you going to say something real?" The question was not confrontational. It was observational, almost innocent, but it carried the kind of weight that only comes from honesty unfiltered by expectation. Richard did not answer immediately. Instead, he exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering for a brief moment before returning to the child. And in that silence, the entire room seemed to understand that whatever came next would not be a continuation of control, but the beginning of something that could no longer be contained by it. The silence that followed the boy's question did not break. It deepened. It became something more structured, as if the entire gala had reorganized itself around the absence of certainty. Richard Callahan stood still, but for the first time, stillness no longer meant control. It meant confrontation with something he had never prepared to define. His eyes remained on the child, but the longer he looked, the less the situation felt like observation and more like recognition forming against his will. Alicia Bennett remained where she was, her posture unchanged, but the air around her carried a different weight now. It was not the weight of revelation itself, but the years behind it, compressed into a single moment that no longer allowed distance. The boy waited. not impatiently, not nervously, but with the quiet expectation of someone who had already lived too long inside unanswered questions. Richard finally spoke again, but his voice carried less authority than before, as if he was no longer certain which version of himself the room was responding to. "Why did you not tell me sooner?" he asked, the words slower than his usual precision. Alicia's response came without hesitation. "Because telling you was never the same as you being present," she said. The distinction lingered in the air, sharp and unsoftened. A few guests lowered their eyes, not out of respect, but discomfort, as if they had unintentionally stepped into a moment they could not interpret safely. Richard's gaze shifted briefly toward the surrounding crowd, then back to Alicia. For the first time, the presence of witnesses no longer reinforced his authority. It diluted it. The boy moved slightly closer to Alicia, not hiding, not retreating, simply aligning himself with the only stability he had ever known. Richard noticed the movement, and something inside him tightened, not in anger, but in a quiet recalibration of everything he thought he understood about distance and responsibility. "I do not understand what you expect from me now," Richard said finally. Alicia shook her head slightly. "Understanding is not the requirement," she replied. "Acknowledgement is." The word landed without force, yet it changed the texture of the room. It was no longer about accusation or defense. It was about recognition of something that had already existed regardless of permission. The boy looked up at Richard again, his voice calm, almost careful. "I am not here to take anything from you," he said. "I am here because I was already here." The simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any argument. Richard's expression shifted subtly, the first visible sign of internal conflict breaking through his composed exterior. He looked at Alicia again, and for the first time, the distance between them no longer felt like separation but like consequence. Alicia stepped slightly forward once more, her voice steady, unwavering. "You built your world without ever asking what existed outside of it," she said. "And now that it has entered your space, you are trying to decide whether it belongs." Richard did not respond immediately. The question was no longer rhetorical. It was structural. Around them, the Gala felt suspended in a kind of shared uncertainty, as if every person in the room had become aware that they were witnessing the collapse of a narrative that had once felt stable. The boy remained still, his presence unchanged, but now fully integrated into the center of attention without seeking it. Richard finally lowered his gaze slightly, not in defeat, but in the beginning of recognition that some truths do not arrive to be debated. They arrive to be absorbed. And in that moment, the distance he had always relied on began to feel less like protection and more like absence he could no longer ignore. The room no longer felt like a celebration space. It felt like a boundary had been crossed that could not be reversed, as if the Gala itself had quietly shifted from an event into a moment of irreversible understanding. Richard Callahan stood at the center of it, but the authority that once defined his presence no longer behaved the same way. It did not vanish, but it no longer reached the people around him with certainty. It fractured slightly with every silence that followed. The boy remained where he was, steady and calm, no longer stepping forward, no longer retreating, simply existing in a space that had finally stopped denying him. Alicia Bennett stood beside him now, closer than before, not as protection but as alignment. Richard looked at both of them, and for the first time, his silence carried more uncertainty than control. He spoke again, but his voice had changed in texture. It was no longer composed in the same way it had been earlier in the evening. "If what you are saying is real," he began, then paused, as if the word real itself had become unstable in his mind. "Then why does it feel like I am?" Hearing it for the first time now, Alicia did not react immediately. When she answered, her tone remained even, but there was something in it that carried long history without needing to explain it. "Because you only listen to what enters your world on your terms," she said. The sentence was not delivered as an accusation. It was delivered as an observation that had already been proven too many times to require emotion. Around them, the Gala guests remained silent, but their stillness had shifted. It was no longer curiosity. It was awareness that they were witnessing something that would not return to its previous state. The boy looked at Richard again, and this time his voice was quieter than before, but more direct. "I do not need anything from you," he said. "I just needed you to know I exist." Those words landed without resistance, because there was nothing in them that demanded defense. Richard's expression changed again, not dramatically, but in small internal adjustments that suggested something long avoided was finally being processed without permission. He looked at Alicia, and the distance between them no longer felt like time. It felt like consequence. Alicia spoke again, her voice steady but no longer soft. "You built decisions without considering outcomes that did not benefit you," she said. "And now you are standing inside one of them." The clarity of the statement removed any remaining ambiguity in the room. No one moved. No one interrupted. Even the background of the gala, the distant music, the subtle noise of crystal glasses, seemed to exist in another layer of reality. Richard slowly lowered his gaze toward the boy again. This time, he did not search for confirmation. He searched for understanding. And in that search, something inside him shifted in a way that was not immediate but irreversible. The boy did not move closer, but he no longer needed to. The space between them had already changed meaning. Alicia placed a hand gently on the boy's shoulder, not as explanation, but as final grounding. Richard remained still, but the stillness was no longer dominance. It was absorption. Around them, the gala continued to exist, but it no longer defined the moment. The moment defined itself. And for the first time that evening, Richard Callahan did not respond as someone controlling the room, but as someone beginning to recognize that the room had already changed without his permission. The air inside the gala had become still in a way that no longer felt temporary. It was the kind of stillness that suggested something irreversible had already happened, even if no one had officially named it. Richard Callahan stood in the center of that silence, and for the first time in his life, the silence did not respond to his presence. It simply existed around him, unchanged by authority, unaffected by expectation. The boy remained in place, no longer moving closer, no longer seeking validation, simply standing as a fact that could not be reduced into uncertainty anymore. Alicia Bennett stood beside him, her posture unchanged, but her presence now carried the weight of continuity, as if she had been holding this moment together long before anyone else realized it was forming. Richard slowly shifted his gaze between them. The familiarity he had begun to resist was no longer something he could negotiate with logic. It was embedded in detail, in expression, in the quiet alignment of features that no longer allowed dismissal. His breathing remained controlled, but the rhythm of it had changed subtly, as if control itself had become something he was now actively maintaining rather than naturally possessing. Around them, the guests of the gala no longer pretended to observe casually. Every movement had slowed into hesitation, as if the entire room understood that any interruption would fracture something already fragile. Richard finally spoke again, but his voice carried a different weight than before. It was no longer the voice of command, but of someone trying to locate stability inside a shifting foundation. "If this is real," he said slowly, pausing between each phrase as if measuring its meaning, "then why was I never given the chance to see it before now?" Alicia did not answer immediately. When she did, her response was steady, not emotional, but precise. "Because seeing requires attention," she said. "And attention is something you only give when it aligns with your assumptions." The sentence did not provoke reaction from her tone, but it changed something in the space between them. It removed any remaining ambiguity about whether this was misunderstanding or delay. It reframed it as consequence. The boy looked up again at Richard, and this time there was no question in his expression. There was only observation. "I did not come here to change your life," he said quietly. "I came because I am already part of it, whether you acknowledge it or not." The simplicity of the words made them harder to dismiss. Richard's gaze lowered slightly, not in defeat, but in recalibration. He was no longer responding as a man managing a situation, but as someone encountering a structure that existed independently of his control. Alicia's voice softened slightly, but remained firm. "There are truths that do not wait for permission," she said. "They arrive when they are ready, not when you are." For the first time that evening, Richard did not immediately respond. The absence of response was not emptiness. It was internal adjustment. Around them, the gala remained frozen in collective awareness, the luxury, the light, the architecture of wealth still intact, but no longer dominant over what was unfolding within it. Richard looked at the boy again, and something in his expression shifted, not into certainty, but into recognition that refusal was no longer a sustainable position. The boy did not move. He did not need to. The distance between them had already changed meaning, no longer defined by space, but by acknowledgement. And in that moment, Richard Callahan, who had built entire systems around control, remained standing inside a reality that could no longer be reorganized around him. The silence inside the Gala no longer behaved like silence. It had become something denser, almost structured, as if every person in the room understood they were witnessing a moment that would not return to its previous form. Richard Callahan stood at the center of it, but for the first time in his life, standing did not equal control. It simply meant presence inside something he could no longer direct. The boy remained still in front of him, no longer stepping forward, no longer retreating, only existing with a calm certainty that made the uncertainty around him feel more visible. Alicia Bennett stood slightly behind and to the side, her posture unchanged, but her presence now carried a kind of finality, as if she had already passed through every version of this moment long before anyone else had arrived at it. Richard's gaze moved slowly between them again. The resemblance he had resisted acknowledging had now crossed into something he could not unsee. It was no longer interpretation. It was structure. The alignment of features, the stillness of expression, the quiet intensity in the eyes, all of it formed a continuity that no longer allowed distance. Richard finally exhaled, a controlled breath that did not resolve anything but marked the end of avoidance. "You are telling me," he said carefully, "that this has been true without my knowledge for years." Alicia did not respond immediately. When she did, her voice remained steady, but it carried a weight that did not require emphasis. "I am telling you that truth does not depend on your awareness to exist," she said. The sentence did not land like confrontation. It landed like confirmation of something already completed. Around them, the guests of the gala no longer shifted casually. They stood in a collective stillness that had lost its decorative quality. It was no longer observation. It was recognition without commentary. The boy looked up at Richard again, and this time his voice carried a quiet clarity that did not seek validation. "I learned to stop waiting," he said. Waiting did not change anything. Richard's expression tightened slightly, not in anger, but in the effort of absorbing something that did not fit into any of the frameworks he had used to understand consequence. He looked at Alicia again, and for the first time, the distance between them felt less like separation and more like a record of what had been excluded from his awareness. Alicia spoke again, her tone unchanged. "You built systems that required you to be informed last," she said. "That is not absence of responsibility. That is structure of avoidance." The words did not escalate tension. They clarified it. Richard remained silent for a moment longer than before. In that silence, something in him shifted, not toward defense, but toward recognition that no immediate response would restore equilibrium. The boy did not move, but his presence now felt fully integrated into the space, no longer an interruption, but an established fact within it. Richard finally lowered his gaze slightly, not away from them, but into a moment that no longer offered the possibility of reinterpretation. Around them, the gala remained physically unchanged, but its meaning had already altered. What had once been an environment of control and hierarchy now functioned only as background to something that could not be reduced back into performance. And in that realization, Richard Callahan stood not as the center of the room, but as someone beginning to understand that the room had already moved beyond the version of reality he had constructed. The stillness inside the gala had reached a point where it no longer felt like part of the event itself. It felt like something suspended above it, observing from a distance that no longer belonged to time. Richard Callahan remained at the center of that stillness, but the role he occupied inside it had changed without his permission. He was no longer the source of structure in the room. He had become part of what was being observed. The boy stood in front of him, unchanged in posture, but now carrying a presence that no longer felt like interruption. It felt like origin. Alicia Bennett remained slightly behind, her calm expression unbroken, yet fully present in a way that suggested she had already lived through every possible reaction this moment could produce. Richard's eyes moved between them again, slower now, not searching for confirmation, but searching for alignment between what he had believed and what was standing in front of him. The pattern was no longer something his mind could avoid. It had become too complete, too consistent, too precise in its repetition across time and detail. Richard finally spoke again, and this time his voice carried less resistance and more fragmentation. "If this is what you are saying," he began, then paused as if the structure of his own language was no longer fully reliable. "Then everything I understood was incomplete." Alicia did not respond immediately. When she did, her voice remained steady, but it carried no softness designed to ease the impact. "It was never incomplete," she said. "It was simply never expanded beyond your perspective." The words did not provoke reaction. They settled. Around them, the gala no longer functioned as a gathering. It functioned as a shared containment of attention, where every guest remained silent not from etiquette, but from the awareness that any sound would feel misplaced against what was unfolding. The boy looked up again at Richard, and his voice remained calm, but it carried a quiet finality that did not require repetition. "I am not asking you to decide anything right now," he said. "I am only here so you cannot say later that you never knew." Richard's expression tightened slightly, not in defense, but in recognition that the statement did not offer an exit. It only offered presence. He looked at Alicia again, and for the first time, the space between them did not feel like distance to be resolved, but like history that had already been written without his participation. Alicia stepped slightly closer, her voice still even, but now carrying a sharper clarity. "You spent years making decisions based on what you were told was relevant," she said, "and you never questioned what was removed before it reached you." The implication did not escalate tension. It clarified structure. Richard did not respond immediately. His silence this time was not resistance. It was processing without immediate translation into control. The boy shifted his weight slightly, still grounded in place, still steady, but now fully part of the room rather than separate from it. Richard finally lowered his gaze again, not away from them, but into a moment where interpretation no longer offered safety. Around them, the gala remained physically unchanged, but its meaning had dissolved into something unrecognizable from its beginning. The architecture, the light, the presence of wealth and order all remained, but none of it defined the moment anymore. And in that realization, Richard Callahan stood not as the figure the room once responded to, but as someone beginning to understand that response itself had already moved beyond him. The moment no longer felt like it belonged to the gala, or even to the building itself. It had expanded beyond its physical boundaries, as if the truth unfolding inside had begun to reshape the space around it. Richard Callahan stood in the center of it, but his presence no longer defined the room. Instead, the room was defining him in ways he could not immediately resist. The boy remained in front of him, steady and unshaken, his expression calm in a way that contrasted sharply with the instability forming around the adults. Alicia Bennett stood slightly behind him, her posture unchanged, but her silence now carried a final kind of certainty, as if everything that needed to be said had already been carried across years rather than moments. Richard's gaze shifted between them again, slower now, no longer searching for missing pieces, but recognizing that the pieces had always been there, just never assembled in front of him. His voice finally broke the silence, but it no longer carried authority. It carried acknowledgement struggling to form language. "If this is real," he said carefully, "then there is no version of my past that remains untouched by it." Alicia did not respond immediately. When she did, her voice remained calm, but it no longer softened the weight of the truth. "Your past is not being changed," she said. "It is being seen completely for the first time." The words settled across the room without resistance. There was no need for reaction from the guests anymore. They were no longer participants in interpretation. They were witnesses to clarity. The boy looked at Richard again, his voice steady but no longer questioning. "I do not need you to fix anything," he said. "I just needed you to stop pretending there was nothing to see." The sentence did not escalate emotion. It removed illusion. Richard's expression shifted subtly, not into shock, but into a quiet recalibration of everything he had once assumed was stable. He looked at Alicia again, and for the first time, the distance between them no longer felt like separation or avoidance. It felt like consequence that had simply waited long enough to be acknowledged. Alicia stepped slightly forward, her voice still controlled, but now carrying a final precision. "You are not being asked to explain yourself," she said. You are being asked to recognize what already exists outside your control. The distinction was absolute. It removed negotiation. Richard did not respond immediately. His silence now was not resistance. It was the collapse of immediate interpretation. Around them, the Gala remained physically intact, but its structure no longer held authority over the moment. The lights, the architecture, the presence of wealth and order all continued to exist, but none of it carried influence over what was now fully exposed in the center of the room. The boy remained still, not advancing, not retreating, fully present without demand. Richard slowly lowered his gaze again, not away from them, but into a space where certainty no longer offered protection. And in that silence, he began to understand that what stood in front of him was not an interruption of his life, but a part of it that had been waiting long before he ever chose to notice it. For the first time since the beginning of the evening, the silence inside the Gala no longer felt like suspension. It felt like completion, as if every unanswered question had slowly converged into a single point that could no longer be delayed. Richard Callahan stood in the center of it, but the role he occupied had changed again. He was no longer the one defining the moment. He was the one being defined by it. The boy remained in front of him, still and composed, no longer carrying the tension of introduction or uncertainty. He simply existed now as something undeniable, something that did not require further validation to remain present. Alicia Bennett stood beside him, her expression unchanged, but her presence now felt like closure rather than explanation, as if she had carried this truth across years without ever needing the rooms. Permission to confirm it. Richard's eyes remained on the boy for a longer moment than before. The resemblance was no longer something his mind tried to interpret in fragments. It had become whole. The structure of recognition was no longer forming. It had already formed, and what remained was acceptance of its presence. Richard finally spoke, and when he did, his voice no longer carried resistance. It carried something closer to acknowledgement that had passed through hesitation. "Then this is not something I can question my way out of," he said slowly. Alicia did not respond immediately. When she did, her voice remained steady, but it carried finality that did not invite continuation. "No," she said. "This is something you can only choose to recognize or continue to avoid." The distinction settled into the room without resistance. Around them, the guests remained silent, but their silence was no longer confusion. It was observation of resolution taking shape in real time. The boy looked at Richard again, his expression calm, but now fully grounded in certainty. "I am not asking you to decide anything about me," he said. "I am only here so that the decision cannot be made without me existing in it." The sentence carried no demand, only presence. Richard's expression shifted subtly again, not into defense, but into a stillness that suggested internal recalibration had reached its limit of delay. He looked at Alicia once more, and for the first time, the distance between them no longer felt like unresolved history. It felt like defined truth that had simply not been acknowledged until now. Alicia stepped slightly closer, her voice quiet but precise. "You are not being asked to repair what happened," she said. "You are being asked to stop separating yourself from what already exists." The words did not provoke reaction. They finalized structure. Richard remained silent for a moment longer than before. That silence no longer held confusion. It held recognition without resistance. The Gala remained physically unchanged around them, but its meaning had fully dissolved into something else. The architecture, the light, the presence of power and status all continued to exist, but none of it carried influence over what had already been established at the center of the room. The boy stood still, not advancing, not retreating, no longer positioned as uncertainty, but as confirmation. Richard slowly lowered his gaze again, not away from them, but into a space where denial no longer had structure to support it. And in that silence, for the first time, he did not respond as someone attempting to understand what was happening, but as someone beginning to understand that it had already happened long before he ever chose to see it. The moment no longer felt like it was unfolding in time. It felt like it had already reached its conclusion, and everything that remained was the quiet recognition of what could no longer be reversed. The Gala, once filled with light, sound, and the illusion of control, now existed only as a distant frame around something far more permanent. Richard Callahan stood at the center of it, But the weight he carried was no longer the weight of authority or confusion. It was the weight of understanding arriving too late to be shaped into anything else. The boy remained in front of him, still and steady, no longer defined by explanation or doubt, but by presence alone. Alicia Bennett stood beside him, her posture unchanged, her expression calm in a way that suggested she had already released the need for validation long before this moment began. Richard's gaze stayed on the boy for a long time without speaking. There was no longer a search in his eyes. There was only recognition settling into place like something that had always been there, but never allowed to surface fully. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, stripped of its earlier distance. "I see it now," he said slowly, as if the words required more than speech to be true. Alicia did not respond immediately. When she did, her voice carried no satisfaction, no emphasis, only final clarity. "You were never meant to be convinced," she said, "only to become aware." The distinction lingered in the air without resistance. Around them, the guests of the gala no longer appeared as participants in an event. They had become witnesses to something that had outgrown performance. The boy looked up at Richard, his expression unchanged, but no longer questioning. "I am not here to change what you were," he said softly. "I am only here because I already am." Richard's expression shifted subtly, not into emotion, but into stillness that came after internal conflict has exhausted itself. He lowered his gaze slightly, not away from the boy, but into a space where denial no longer had structure. For the first time, there was no need for him to interpret, defend, or reframe what stood in front of him. It simply existed, complete and unalterable. Alicia placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder, not as reassurance, but as grounding. "You do not need permission to exist in someone's truth," she said. Richard remained silent for a moment longer, and in that silence something within him settled, not into resolution, but into acceptance of responsibility without negotiation. The gala lights continued to shine. The architecture remained unchanged, but none of it defined the moment anymore. What defined it was presence, recognition, and the absence of any further need for denial. Richard finally looked at Alicia, then back at the boy, and when he spoke again, there was no attempt to control what came next. "Then I will no longer pretend this is separate from me," he said. The words did not change the past, but they marked the end of resistance to it. Alicia gave a small nod, not of approval, but of acknowledgement that what needed to happen had finally aligned with reality. The boy did not move closer, and he did not step away. He simply remained, no longer as interruption, but as part of something that had always existed beneath silence. Around them, the gala continued to exist, but only as background to a truth that had already completed its arrival. And in that quiet center of understanding, Richard Callahan stood no longer as a man trying to define the situation, but as someone finally recognizing that it had already defined him long before he ever spoke a word.